Hello. Today we continue the conversation with Anatoly Fomenko about the origins of the scientific theory, the new chronology. Today we will talk about the scholars who criticized history and chronology long before the advent of Fomenko-Nosovsky's new chronology. Hello, Anatoly Timofeyevich.
Hello, Svetlana. Thank you for the introduction.
Anatoly Timofeyevich, it is known that since the 16th century, scholars have been criticizing the chronology of Scholars-predecessors and the version of world history built on its basis. Please tell us about these scholars and their works.
Down the road, when I became interested in history, naturally, alongside my work in mathematics, it turned out that questions about chronology did not arise with me or Nikolai Morozov for the first time. They had arisen long ago. For example, in the 18th century, the renowned scholar Jane Hardwin made a statement and wrote a book in which he declared that ancient dates needed revision, and that Scholars-predecessors' version was incorrect on a large scale. Then, as I discovered, in Germany, there was a well-known historian named Robert Baldauf. In the early 20th century, he wrote a book titled History and Criticism, where, apparently without knowing about Johnson's works, he also stated that ancient chronology needed a radical revision. Next, the renowned Isaac Newton appears to have researched chronological questions and wrote a book, titled, The Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended. In his book, Isaac Newton proposed very serious revisions to ancient events, not just by a few decades. It turns out that Newton shifted part of the history of ancient Greece forward in time, closer to us, on average by 300 years. The history of ancient Egypt, which today spans a huge interval of several thousand years, roughly from 3000 BC and above, was moved up and compressed by Isaac Newton into a short period of only 330 years. And so on. Newton subjected many events that had occurred before the year 200 to a radical reassessment. However, he did not go further. As I found out, this book was published, caused a great scandal, and then was forgotten and removed from scholarly discourse. Newton, although he was a great mathematician and physicist, was accused of going mad by writing a nonsensical work on chronology, questioning the dates of antiquity, making it uninteresting and unworthy of study. It was forgotten. The next scholar to raise questions about chronology was our outstanding scientist and encyclopedist Nikolai Morozov, an honorary academician of the Academy of Sciences, and the author of many works on chemistry, mathematics, physics, and chronology. He wrote a significant work known to us today as Christ, a title given by the publishers when the work was published in the early 20th century. The original title was The History of Human Culture in Natural Light. In this work, Morozov, apparently unaware of the previous research by Isaac Newton, Robert Baldauf, Edwin Johnson, and others, concluded that the chronology of Scholars-predecessors needed a radical revision. He proposed his scheme of dating ancient dates and suggested several methods for studying ancient manuscripts. He analyzed dates up to the 5th–6th century AD and proposed new dates, pushing many ancient events closer to our time. As I mentioned, This work was known at the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics, but, nevertheless, similar to Newton's case, the society's and primarily historians' attitude towards this work was cautious and negative. It was claimed that Morozov's research was not scientific, and this work was withdrawn from scientific circulation. If I hadn't become interested in this work myself, I certainly wouldn't have discovered any new arguments in favor of revising ancient history based on old research.
Anatoly Timofeyevich, could you briefly explain how scientific methods are applied to date historical events?
It became clear that it was necessary to investigate dating because the arguments of Johnson, Robert Baldauf, Jean Hardwin, Isaac Newton, and Morozov were very serious. I became more interested in this. It's clear that in addition to chronological and historical arguments, historians use references to datings obtained through methods of physics and dendrochronology. Dendrochronology is the well-known method that allegedly managed to confirm the datings of events in the Middle Ages and antiquity. I conducted research on this method. It turned out that, unfortunately, the dendrochronology method is not independent. It is impossible to build a single continuous scale starting from our time and extending down to antiquity based solely on comparing the thickness of tree rings. Such a scale does not exist today. The continuous scale, stretched from our time downwards, ends somewhere around the 11th century AD. Beyond that, this scale consists of separate blocks that were inserted into antiquity solely based on references to the previous dating given by Scaliger-Petavius. You can read more about this in our books on chronology. Therefore, it became clear that the dendrochronology method is also not independent, and analysis requires further study. All of this greatly interested me. I turned to the analysis of the radiocarbon method, which is considered one of the main physical arguments in favor of the currently accepted chronology. It turned out that the situation here is also very complex. The idea of the method itself is very reasonable. The method's author, physicist Libby, proposed a quite reasonable idea. However, it turned out that its practical application, once again, relies on a pre-assumed known scale of Scaliger-Petavius's dates. Additionally, this method is quite inaccurate. It was revealed, and this is not my discovery but a well-known fact among specialists in radiocarbon dating, that the radiocarbon method in its modern state has an accuracy of plus or minus 1 to 2,000 years on samples whose age is estimated at no more than 1,000 or 1,500 years. Therefore, it is currently not applicable for dating samples with an age of 2,000 years or less. In other words, the method can't say much about the chronology of events in the last 2 millennia. It needs, at the very least, recalibration without relying on the chronology of Scaliger-Petavius. There are other methods developed by physicists, but they are even more approximate than radiocarbon dating. At the same time, it was found that archaeological methods, without relying on the chronology of written sources and chronicles, do not provide absolute dates. Only in rare cases can these methods determine the relative chronology of some finds. Moreover, even at the beginning of our work on chronology, it became clear that the Scaligerian chronology, explicitly or implicitly, infiltrated the calibrations of archaeological and even physical methods, including, as I have already mentioned, the radiocarbon method. This raises questions about the applicability of the method in its current form for dating historical objects. And finally, in our opinion, an utterly criminal fact, as acknowledged by some archaeologists, and references to these materials can be found in our books. There is a deeply flawed practice of preliminary familiarization of physical laboratories dating samples by the radiocarbon method, with a prior opinion of archaeologists on the approximate age of the discovery. Initially, they are informed of the approximate age, and physicists supposedly slightly refine these datings. This is certainly a corrupt practice. It needs to be revisited, and radiocarbon datings should be retested and recalibrated. One more story that surprised me a lot and caught my attention is the famous dating of the Shroud of Turin. The shroud is considered a sacred object associated with the crucifixion of Christ. It is believed to have wrapped his body. In the 20th century, radiocarbon dating of this object was carried out. Unlike other radiocarbon datings, the correct methodology was applied here. Samples of the shroud were meticulously dated in several laboratories, as we advocate doing today. The answer was obtained. It turned out that by the radiocarbon method, the shroud is dated not to the 1st century AD, as believed, but to the 11th–13th centuries AD. This is another argument for the need to retest dating methods accepted by physicists.
Anatoly Timofeyevich, please tell us about the astronomical dating method.
Many dates rely on astronomy evidence. Old texts contain descriptions of eclipses, descriptions of zodiacs, so-called horoscopes, i.e., descriptions of events that can in principle be dated today. On this subject, astronomers have certainly conducted research. They extracted descriptions of lunar and solar eclipses from old chronicles. Some descriptions are detailed, others less so. When an eclipse is described along with its parameters, in principle, this information can be dated based on existing methods today. Starting from the 19th century and into the 20th century, historians of astronomy used this information. But as it turns out, and we write about it in detail in our books, they relied on the same chronology of Scholars-predecessors. In other words, their method is not independent. It also depends on the dates assigned to events in the 16th–17th centuries. I found that Morozov rightly criticized these datings. He reviewed the datings again, relying on objective dating methods, on astronomical methods. He redated many descriptions of old eclipses and found that they move closer to us in time by hundreds of years. The most vivid examples are the descriptions of the famous triad of eclipses in the work of the renowned Greek historian Thucydides in his History of the Peloponnesian War. With objectively independent dating of the descriptions of these eclipses, and they are described in great detail, their date falls not in the 5th century BC, as is believed today, but in the 12th or 13th centuries AD. A shift upwards of more than 1,000 years. This fact became very significant for me. I began to understand that the revision of ancient chronology cannot be reduced to correcting individual dates and that we are dealing with a very serious and profound effect, with deep errors in dating. These errors reach hundreds, and sometimes thousands of years. So, I pursued a path where I realized that understanding dating requires the use of mathematical, statistical, and astronomical methods. Arguments that would not depend on the personal biases of chroniclers and historians but would have an objective and verifiable character. I spent a considerable amount of time creating several methods based on mathematical and statistical considerations. These methods aimed at independently and objectively dating events described in ancient and medieval written sources. However, we will discuss these methods in a separate narrative. Now, let me share a brief story in which Gleb Nosovsky and I were involved. This is one of the dating methods for descriptions in ancient sources, namely zodiacs or horoscopes, using modern astronomical and mathematical programs. The thing is, that in old texts and in ancient depictions, it is quite common to find images of the celestial sky and the 12 zodiac constellations with 5 or 7 planets arranged in them. In antiquity, it was believed that there were 7 planets, including the Sun and the Moon. Usually a zodiac, drawn for example on the wall of an ancient temple, displays the arrangement of planets by constellations. This event can be dated. The idea of a celestial clock lies in depicting the state of the sky. The zodiac serves as the clock face. The 12 zodiac constellations are like numbers on the clock face, and the 7 clock hands are the planets that glide across the clock face. Each hand is a planet in the zodiac. When the position of the hands is fixed, we can date that event. Even before us, historians of astronomy tried to date zodiac depictions found in ancient chronicles, on the walls of ancient temples, on the lids of coffins discovered in ancient Egypt. Attempts were made, but unfortunately, they were made with reference to the presumed established and unshakable chronology of Scholars-predecessors. When the mathematical solution of a particular zodiac or horoscope did not fit into the Scholars-predecessors scheme, astronomers would say that the artist made certain mistakes, and the image needs to be adjusted here and there. Through such stretching, ancient zodiacs were very often forcibly squeezed into the chronology of Scholars-predecessors. We approached this from the perspective of objective researchers. It became clear that it is not advisable to pre-limit ourselves with any a priori dating interval. We needed to consider all possible solutions to this astronomical and mathematical problem and then determine the era to which, for example, the zodiac depicted on the wall or ceiling of an ancient Egyptian temple belongs. We did that. We analyzed practically all known descriptions of zodiacs and their depictions that have come down to us. We discovered many zodiacs ourselves and also dated them. During our expeditions, we specifically surveyed ancient temples, old churches, palaces, and found quite a few depictions of zodiacs on ceilings and walls that astronomers had not previously paid attention to. We dated these zodiacs. It turned out that there is an effect, first discovered by Morozov, namely the shifting of the dating of zodiacs from the distant past closer to our time, to the era from the 12th to the 18th, and sometimes even the 19th century AD. We started with dating the zodiacs of ancient Egypt. There are two famous zodiacs in the temple at Dendera, the round and the rectangular zodiacs. Using strained interpretations, historians and astronomers dated these images to approximately the beginning of the Common Era. We discovered these long stretches and redated these images. It turned out that they belong to the 12th century AD. The round zodiac, in particular, is dated to the year 1185 AD. And so on. I'll mention just a few dates that we obtained. First, the dates known in the history of ancient Egypt. The round Dendera zodiac dates back to the 12th century. The rectangular Dendera zodiac also dates back to the 12th century. The zodiac from the Great Temple of Esna is from the 14th century. And so on. In other words, all the zodiacs known today, discovered by Egyptologists in ancient Egypt, when approached with an unbiased and objective mindset, are dated from the 12th century to the 17th or 18th century. We compiled a final table listing all the zodiacs known to us and found by us. This table is presented in our books and is very interesting. We also created a frequency histogram showing the years from the 10th century AD to the 19th century AD in which the dating of ancient zodiacs falls. This histogram is presented in our books, in our publications with Nosovsky. There is a significant spike in the 13th century AD and another major spike in the 16th and 17th centuries AD. According to astronomy, according to the dating of the zodiacs of ancient Egypt, this is where the history of ancient Egypt, mistakenly placed today long before the beginning of the Common Era, is located. The storyline that we initiated is still unfolding. In the end, I have outlined a more or less complete, albeit brief picture of the development of research on the new chronology, where it all began and what it has led to.
Anatoly Timofeyevich, you made a discovery and shared it with the public. Could you please tell us how mathematicians and historians reacted to it?
The reaction was very lively. I must say that among mathematicians, I found significant support. Together with my colleague Gleb Nosovsky, who joined me later, we continued to develop these methods. I presented at many mathematical conferences dedicated to statistics and objective methods of analyzing old texts. Mathematicians responded quite professionally and with great interest. I want to mention that many mathematicians and physicists assisted in publishing articles on this topic, and the articles were unconventional. They carefully scrutinized our arguments, and there were numerous reviews of my works. In the end, the main results were published in the Central Mathematical Press. Today, they are accessible, and anyone interested can take my publications in the Central Mathematical Press, verify them, and independently confirm that the conclusions I reached, later with Nosovsky, are of an objective nature. From the side of mathematicians, the reaction was very friendly and supportive. I am grateful to my colleagues who significantly contributed to the development of this theme. On the part of historians, the reaction was different. As I mentioned earlier, the initial reaction came from Professor Kuzishchin, who told me that mathematicians should not meddle in history. They should stick to mathematics, and historians should focus on history. Unfortunately, in contemporary historical culture, there are no objective methods for verifying dates. Dates are considered long established, and historians learn them in university, memorizing them like multiplication table without engaging in reassessing dates and datings. Unfortunately, historians today lack independent and objective verification methods. I, along with my colleagues, proposed, for example, to establish a special course at the History Department of Moscow State University for students, graduate students, and interested historians on mathematical methods of dating events, statistics, and astronomy. The goal was to collectively analyze ancient chronology. Unfortunately, my proposals did not receive any response. The next stage in the reaction of historians was irritation and a very negative response, which partially continues to this day. There were many different critical and sharply negative statements from historians in the press and on television. Very strange letters were written to the country's leadership, demanding the termination of our research on chronology, urging to stop the invasion of mathematicians into history, and to protect world and national history from the attacks of mathematicians. Unfortunately, all of this has nothing to do with science. Still, from the very beginning of our work, my colleagues and I continue to call for collaboration with historians. It would undoubtedly be fruitful, and the introduction of methods of objective dating into history would benefit it.
Anatoly Timofeyevich, thank you very much for the interesting narrative.
Thank you for your attention.
Dear viewers, we appreciate your interest in our podcasts. See you in a week on the channel of the Multimedia Museum of the New Chronology.